All right, welcome back, everyone. Appreciate you guys joining us for this study. Uh, Today we're going to be Mark chapter 10, and we'll look at verses 1 through 12. So if you want to start turning there, go ahead. Again, Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. It'll be a few minutes before we get there, but like I said, if you want to go ahead and turn there, that's the wrong bookmark. There we go. Just as a reminder to anyone that's interested, Crawford Baptist Church in Sims on Sun Valley Drive will be doing an evangelism class starting July the 8th. Class is at 6:30 to 7:30 in the auditorium, and if you'd like to come share a meal with us beforehand, we normally eat between 5:30 and 6:30, and there's no set price for the meal. We do take donations just to help cover costs. We'd appreciate it if you do join the meal that you would give to it. But either way, come join us, please. If you live in the Mobile area, and I understand some people already have church commitments on Wednesday nights, but encourage your whole church to come. The more the merrier, man. This is really about helping equip the saints to do the work of ministry, right? We've preached the pastors at Crawford have preached a whole series on the Great Commission and going out and reaching others for Jesus. And now, as a follow-up to that, we're going to try and train people to go and reach others for Jesus. And seriously, y'all all come. I don't care if you're members of the church or not. Come be as a guest. Come join us. I think it's really going to be worthwhile and worth attending. It does sound like I'm going to be able to get recordings of them and upload them on this YouTube channel, but as of right now, I cannot promise that. So to make sure you don't miss it, come in person if you can. Sorry, I gotta plug that. I'm gonna keep plugging that until we get there because it's very important to me. This is I just think it's gonna be great, and I've had my hands in it, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not gonna be the only teacher of it, but I'm gonna teach some of it, and I really think it's gonna be worthwhile for anyone that claims the name of Christ, because the Great Commission is to go and make disciples of all the nations, right? And so if you're not doing that, you're missing something in your walk with Jesus. Don't get nervous. I know I've got an extra book. I'm just going to read from Josephus a little bit at one point today, just to get the first century view on what we're talking about, so to speak. Sometimes rather than just take my word for it, I'd rather show you where it comes from and cite it directly. That's probably more valuable than just you believing me and repeating what I've said, right? At least now you've heard it from the source. So today, we are going to talk about marriage. I titled this, "When is Divorce Acceptable?" And that may be a little misleading because I'm not going to address everything on that topic. But we're going to talk about what Jesus teaches on the topic. In our culture today, if you live in America, which, I live in the United States of America, marriage has been highly degraded in our culture. In fact, at this point, it's almost difficult to define what marriage is. And it's been my experience that your views on marriage are often passed from generation to generation. So people who have parents that have been married for a long time and took it very seriously tend to also exhibit that behavior, and those who don't often don't. One thing that's important in that discussion is children thrive. I didn't look up the studies, but I know statistically children thrive when their biological mother and father are both in the home for their upbringing. And that's the way God designed it. That's the way it should be. And we'll get into this more deeply as we go. I'm not going to say too much just yet, but I was raised in a home where my parents were married. My parents are still married, praise God. And my dad instilled into me that the design for humans is for one man to marry one woman and to stay together for life, right? I know we joke, when we said when death do us part, we weren't making a commitment, we were setting a goal, ha ha ha, that sort of stuff. But in all reality, like, I got married in 2004. I was not a believer, nor was my wife, but we both we valued each other. We wanted to spend our lives together, and we got married. And I remember on my wedding day, I looked at her and I said, "Hey, don't mess this up for me. This is the only time in my life I'm doing this. I'm never getting married again." And I really did mean that. And I am grateful that after over 20 years, almost 22, it'll be 22 in November, her and I have been married. Her and I have both kept that commitment to one another, and it's just a wonderful thing. And marriage is meant to be, between one man and one woman for life. And so if I know my wife is going to watch this at some point, I'd like to say, I love you, sweetheart. I am just as committed today as I was the day we got married, and thank you for marrying me, because I wouldn't be here if not for you. So I want to tell you what I am going to do and what I'm not going to do before we dive into this. I am going to go through Jesus' teaching on divorce in Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. We're going to talk about why the discussions brought up, what some of the views in the day were, and what Jesus' view was. What I am not going to do is to tell you whether or not you can get divorced in your current situation. And the reason for that is because that is a very personal thing. It depends greatly on individual circumstances and exactly what's going on. And that's not advice I can offer you standing here, not knowing who you are or anything about your marriage. Okay? And I'll talk about that more later, but understand, if you're in a difficult situation in your marriage and you want to get divorced and you're asking if you can get divorced as a Christian, I'm not going to answer that question in this video. I'm telling you that up front. I'm going to tell you what Jesus teaches on this subject. And then from there, you will have to seek further guidance. Okay? So just be warned on that. So one thing the pastors at Crawford often do in their sermons that I've taken a liking to and I'm trying to incorporate into my own teachings is, toward the beginning of the sermon, they tell us that, this is the big picture. This is what I expect you to get out of this. Okay, and like I said, I'm trying to incorporate that in. I think last week I said, if you want the Cliff's Notes version, here it is. So I'm going to try in every teaching give you guys, hey, this is the big picture. So today's big picture in these verses is that divorce is a last resort and marriage is a sacred covenant. Excuse me. Let me start over. So the big picture is that divorce is a last resort and marriage is a sacred covenant before God that should not be taken lightly. Okay? And so I think today's verses are going to support that statement. And let's read our verses and let's dive in, because I think I'm going to need the time. We got a lot to address today. So Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12, we read, And standing up, he went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. And some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he answered and said to them, What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote for you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And in the house, the disciples began questioning him about this again. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Okay. So there's your verses. Let's walk through them. In verse 1, we read that Jesus stands up and he goes to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. So the last time we looked at things, Jesus was in Capernaum, right? North side of the Sea of Galilee. And I'm going to put a map up just to kind of show. But so they moved south around the Sea of Galilee. And then, as was a common Jewish custom, they crossed the Jordan River and travel south through the region called Perea so that they can avoid Samaria, right? Samaria sits kind of right in the middle of Israel, separating Galilee from Judea. Galilee's up here, Judea's down here. And so you go to the east side of the Jordan, you can come south and avoid the Samaritans and Samaria. It's a very common practice to travel that way as you pilgrimaged to Jerusalem. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied today. That's fairly normal. This happens somewhere in Perea before he gets across the Jordan, headed into Jerusalem. But this is the final journey. This is Jesus going to Jerusalem. The start of chapter 11 is the triumphal entry, right? And that starts the last week of Jesus' life. And I won't go into it too deep today, but the purpose for Jesus going to Jerusalem is not just to suffer and die. He is going as the king returning to his capital city to inspect how the people who have been entrusted with his kingdom have maintained it. So get that in your head as we head toward Holy Week. There's more to it than just Jesus showing up to be crucified. So they're headed to Jerusalem, and in Perea he has crowds gather around him. And so according to his custom or his tradition, right, he begins to teach them. That's what Jesus does. The crowds gather and Jesus teaches them. So then in verse 2, we have the Pharisees come forward out of the crowd. So they push their way through the crowd, get to the front, and they ask Jesus a question. Excuse me, teacher. And so they come to test him. So testing him isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily like in a negative connotation, okay? That's one thing that's important to understand. The idea of testing something or someone is to see whether or not it's good or evil, whether it's pure or impure, right? You think about it like when they mine gold. I remember, when was that? Was that in elementary school? We lived in Nevada, and we went to a gold mine there in Nevada, and they actually took us in the room where they heat the gold until it's molten, and they show how all the impurities float to the top, and they'd remove the impurities off, and the pure would be left behind. And you get that image actually a lot in the Bible where it says things will be tested by fire, right? So that's the idea. The Pharisees are coming forward to see whether or not Jesus is a true teacher. Now, I would also guess, and I'm not the only person, right? Commentators would agree, that they're trying to make Jesus look bad. Their goal in all of this is to see, like, well, where's he going to fall? And we're going to talk about it more in a few minutes, but there was a great debate about the divorce question at the time in the first century, and no matter how Jesus answers this question, he's going to make someone mad. And he may, depending on how he answers the question, he may end up denying Moses. And so, again, as we've seen in the past, they're trying to trap him in his words. Right? As soon as he shows back up in public, getting close to Jerusalem, there they are. And they've got this trick question. They love to bring him these trick questions to try and see, or maybe not trick questions so much as loaded questions, right? To see, where's he going to fall on this, and can we expose him? Like, maybe he's going to prove himself to not be in line with normal Jewish teaching, and then we got him. It could also be, there's a theory out there, he's in Perea. So the ruler of Perea at the time is Herod Antipas, who, if you remember from our Herod family tree we did a while back, he was married to Herodias, who was his brother's ex-wife, right? Remember, they both left their spouses to marry one another. And so it could be that, much like what, John the Baptist openly and loudly proclaimed that this marriage was unlawful, and it could be that they're trying to get Jesus to do the same thing, so maybe Antipas will just take care of their problem, right? Maybe Jesus will get beheaded like John. So they ask him about divorce. And again, probably because it was a heavily debated topic and it stood to leave him embarrassed. So in verse 3, Jesus asks them, what did Moses command you? He refers them to the scriptures. You guys already have this answer. It's in the scriptures. But notice Jesus asks, what did Moses command? Now in verse 4, they respond, and they do quote Moses. They say Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. So rather than answer the question Jesus asked, they answer a slightly different question. Jesus asked, what did Moses command? They answer, this is what Moses permitted. Okay, you guys see that difference? Because before we get done, Jesus is going to explain to them very plainly what Moses commanded, but they have answered with what Moses permitted. Now they're quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 24 in verse 1, and let's just go ahead and turn to it now, because it's going to be important to our coming discussion. That's Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is Deuteronomos, or second law. This is the second giving of the law by Moses. Right? This is kind of Moses' last hurrah speech before he dies. So, okay. Verses 1 through 4 are one big sentence. We're going to read it all, and then I'm not going to break them down, so to speak, but I want to point out a couple things about them before we dive back into Mark and how that goes. So, Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, Moses writes, or Moses is speaking to the congregation and says, if a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she goes out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before Yahweh, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahweh your God gives you as an inheritance. So just notice up front, This is an if statement. It starts with, if this happens, then these are the rules about it. This is like case law, right? It's not, this is the rule. It's like, in this situation. So that's the first most important part. It's a situational thing, right? So if you divorce your wife and she goes and has another husband, then you can't take her back. Even if the guy dies, no matter what, you can't remarry her. That's the whole idea in those 4 verses. But verse 1 is where all the argument in the first century lies. So, in verse 5, right, Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. And so Jesus' point is, yeah, you're right. God does permit a divorce, but it's because of your hardness of heart. So, oh, I'm sorry. I got her a little early. Anyway, so verse 4, here's the debate, right? Sorry, give me 1 sec. Let me look this over one more time, make sure I didn't. Yeah. So they're citing Deuteronomy 24. So at the time, in the first century, there were 2 schools in Jerusalem, right? One was the school of Shammai, and one was the school of Hillel. These were both Jewish rabbis that lived in the early 1st century BC to the early 1st century AD. They started schools, and they were religious schools. Okay, so Shammai was typically the more conservative one. And in his mind, indecency, right? It says, if a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found indecency in her, some indecency in her, Shammai took that to say indecency is adultery. It is unfaithfulness. And so, therefore, the only reason you can divorce is adultery. Okay? That's the one view. Hillel was a little more free or liberal, not in the political sense, just with his interpretation, right? He was more free. And Hillel would say that because he found some indecency or any indecency, indecency means anything displeasing. As if to say, it's written that he commented, even if she spoiled the meal, he could divorce her. There's another commentator that's later that says, even if he found a woman that was more attractive to him, he could divorce his previous wife. So you see the difference, right? And in Josephus, so this is in Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 8, in paragraph 23, specifically in verse 253, Josephus writes, he that desires to be divorced from his wife for any cause whatsoever, and many such causes happen among men, let him in writing give assurance that he will never use her as his wife any more. For by this means she may be at liberty to marry another husband, although before this bill of divorce be given, she is not to be permitted so to do, but if she be misused by him also, or if, when he is dead, her first husband would marry her again, it shall not be lawful for her to return to him. So not only does Josephus repeat what we read in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, but he also seems to take the view of Hillel, saying that he can divorce his wife for any cause. So just understand, like, that is a huge debate at the time. Now, men, don't get excited. You cannot divorce your wife because she burned the toast. You can't. And women, don't get excited. You can't divorce your husband because he cut the grass wrong or didn't fix your car, right? That's not. But that was the debate at the time, and that was really kind of the thought that First of all, the power of divorce sat with the man. Right? It never talks about a woman being permitted to give a certificate of divorce to her husband. Just the man can give her one. And given the way it's written, the indecency, I would tend to side with Shammai. But truthfully, that could be my tradition and my upbringing. Right? So let's move on. Into verse 5, Jesus says, the reason that you were given this commandment is because of your hardness of heart, because you're unforgiving. Right? That's basically what it says, because you have a hard heart, because you don't forgive. So notice, he doesn't settle their debate for them. He doesn't. He just says, oh yeah, the reason this was written is your hardness of heart. And then he goes on to explain. So in verses 6 through 9, rather than go to Deuteronomy or Leviticus or Numbers, right, the law, which although Genesis was considered to be part of the law, it was part of Moses, it was part of the Torah, Jesus goes back to creation. So turn with me to Genesis. Genesis chapter 1. Let's go back and look at what Jesus quotes. And I know Mark cites it, but I just want us to go back and read it because it's important. Right? So Genesis 1, at verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, so that they will have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's what Jesus cites. And then God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that creeps on the earth. So Jesus specifically quotes verse 27, right? Male and female, he created them. Now go forward one chapter to Genesis 2, verse 23. So waking up from his surgery, Adam says, then the man said, this one finally is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman because this one was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's what Moses commanded in Jesus' mind, right? So, let's see here. Sorry, I'm just checking my notes. I don't want to repeat myself too much. So understand that marriage was created by God before the fall, right? Marriage is a covenant before God. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. Think about a covenant cutting ceremony, right? What would happen? You would get two leaders or rulers together, and they would make a deal. They would exchange promises, and as part of that, they would sacrifice a number of animals and split them in two, and lay half of each animal on each side, creating an aisle up the center that was filled with the blood of these animals. And then both of the people entering the covenant would go up through the aisle, through the blood. They would reaffirm their promises, and the animals and anyone else there were witnesses. And the basic idea was, if I do not uphold my end of this agreement, let happen to me what has happened to these animals, right? Let me be split in two. That's a covenant. That's how you cut a covenant in the ancient world. Marriage, think about it. Where does the aisle come from? The idea of cutting a covenant. The bride and groom are supposed to come up the aisle, not just the bride. The groom should not stand at the front of the marriage and then the bride come in, because then she's the only one entering through the aisle of the covenant. I understand this doesn't translate exactly into the modern world. We haven't split animals in half, so there's not blood to traipse through. But look at the symbolism of it. We have witnesses, and it is until death. Right? Because if I break this covenant, let what happened to these animals be done to me. That is why marriage is until death do us part. It is a covenant. And it is not just a covenant before men, it is a covenant before God. Think about the way a marriage traditionally has been conducted. We have gathered here in the sight of God. God is the witness to the covenant. It's not something to be taken lightly. All right. Also notice that Jesus says marriage is between a male and a female. Because that's the way God designed it. Not because it's, the preference of the Christian world today. That's how God designed it. That's what God commanded. He created them male and female. And a man shall leave his mother and father and cling or hold on to his wife, cleave to her, right? There's something a lot deeper that happens in marriage that Jesus alludes to as well, where he says the two become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. The idea is you become one organism. Okay, the best illustration I've found for this, or I've heard for this, is a key and a lock. Right? How many of you have a ring full of keys? It's got like 20 keys on it, and some of them you know what they go to, but some of them you don't. Right? That's common, especially among men. You got this big ring of keys, and you're like, I don't remember what that goes through, but you don't want to throw it away because one day you may find the lock. Well, just like a key without a lock is worthless, a man without his wife is worthless, and vice versa. And the key is made to fit the lock. I'm not going any deeper there, but in the unity of marriage, we become one living organism together so that it's no longer just me and my wife that exist, but it is we that exist. Okay? A husband that does his job well loves his wife as he loves himself. That's Paul, right? And Paul takes it one further, says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Well, certainly I would sacrifice myself to save myself. So would I not sacrifice myself to save my wife? You follow, I know that's a little convoluted, but you follow the train of thought. Okay, so I do want to make a comment on current American government and politics, and I am certain I'm going to have someone just get madder than a hornet's nest at me for this. But I'm going to give you my honest and raw opinion, okay? America is founded on the principle of freedom and rights for every citizen. Marriage is biblically defined as being between one man and one woman for life. It is a covenant before God. Okay? However, in our current world, in the laws that govern this country, people who are married gain benefits based on that status. Okay, so you have different rules for taxes. You have different levels of being taxed. In the military, you get different allowances, so a different rate of pay for being married. Okay, you understand the difference between a theological, proper, godly marriage and a legal marriage as seen by the laws of the United States. I'm trying to create a separation there, right? Those are two different categories, and you need to recognize that. From a legal standpoint, if you do not permit a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman, you are making them a different class of citizen based on their sexuality and their choice. Okay, I understand that their sexuality may be is sin, okay? And I understand that it's not in keeping with God's law. But we are not a theocracy. We are a republic. We are a representative government for the people, by the people. And unless we are going to institute into law the Christian definition of marriage, which then would require us to more or less become a theocracy or a sacral state where everyone's a Christian whether they want to be or not, right? They tried that in Europe. Didn't work out so well. Right? Unless you're going to do that, you cannot have two categories. You can't have a category that gets special treatment from the state and then say it can only be between a biological male and a biological female. That's not just. That is not fair to the rest of the people being governed that don't want that arrangement. Does that make sense? I know that's a nuanced thought, and I'm sure I'm going to get an angry tongue lashing from somebody for having said this. Marriage is between a man and a woman. It is a covenant before God. But a social contract that gives you tax breaks and benefits from the government is not marriage and should be permitted for everyone, regardless of the way they choose to sin. Okay? Because married people sin. People entering in this covenant sin just as much as the people wanting to enter this social contract. I hope that is clear to you guys. I'm not saying that I support what they call gay marriage, because it's not real marriage. But I am saying from a political standpoint, from a legal standpoint, if we're going to give tax breaks and benefits to people that are married, we should permit them to enter into a similar contract where they can get the same tax breaks and benefits. Okay? Anything otherwise is unjust. That's my personal opinion. Flame spray me on the internet for having said it. Whatever. But that's where I stand on that. Well, let's go on to Jesus says in verse 9, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And this goes back to the idea of covenant, where God is the witness of the covenant. God has joined you together in your marriage. God has made you one flesh with one another by your marriage. And so we are not to permit that to be separated. Not by men. Not because she burnt the toast. Right? Not because I snore too loud or I fart at night when I'm sleeping. Sorry, bad joke. You get the idea, though. Jesus is saying men should not break apart what God has instituted, not what God has sanctified and made holy. Men should not cancel that out. So in verses 10 through 12, they go into the house, so they're in private now. And the disciples continue to ask Jesus about this. And so Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And now verse 12 is interesting. If she divorces her husband, which women didn't have the right to do at the time, so this is kind of radical, right? But the same principle, and marries another man, she's committing adultery. They don't contain the exception for adultery like you find in Matthew, where he says other than because of fornication or adultery. But the idea is already there, right? It's in the Mosaic Law. It was already illegal to commit adultery. It was already a capital crime to commit adultery. If you caught your wife in adultery, her and the man she was doing it with were stoned to death. And, I mean, there wouldn't be any need for a divorce, right? Because she'd be dead. So I think that's why it's not mentioned here. Not that Jesus didn't say it. It's just redundant. It's unnecessary. The basic idea is men and women should not divorce, and really even for adultery. If you think about it in principle, Jesus says the reason God permitted divorce is because of man's hard heart. Now, I understand that someone committing adultery against you, it would devastate me. I don't know that I would ever be able to forgive her or that I would ever want her around me again. Just to be real with you guys. But I would hope that in prayer and by the Spirit, I would find forgiveness in my heart. Again, I've never had to deal with that situation. I don't know what that's going to look like if it ever comes up. Hopefully it doesn't. But truthfully, what I would do and what I pray between, what I pray I would do could be two very different things. I do think Jesus absolutely permits divorce in the case of adultery. There's some other situations where I think Jesus also would permit divorce that I didn't write down my scripture references for, but they make sense. Paul specifically in 1 Corinthians 7 says, if you're married to an unbeliever and they decide that they'll still live with you, stay with them. He says if you're married to an unbeliever and they leave, you're free, right? So that's one legal divorce. If you're married to an unbeliever and they functionally abandon you, you're free to divorce them. And then you have all these difficult situations, right? What if he's abusive and he literally beats you up every night? What if she's abusive and she literally beats you up every night? I would say that the biblical principle is protection of life and children. And so divorce would probably be permitted in that case. There's steps that would need to be... That's why this is such a difficult topic, right? And that's why I said I'm not going to tell you guys when you can get divorced, because there's a whole lot that goes into it. Let me read, I've got a quotation from a commentary I read that I found very helpful. And I just, especially given the state of things in the United States today with regards to marriage and the divorce rates, the more people that can hear this, and I may try and put it on the screen for you, the better. So this is from R. Kent Hughes in his commentary on Mark, and he writes, "The Lord Jesus Christ permitted divorce and remarriage on one ground and one ground only, marital unfaithfulness. Notice that he permitted it, he did not command it. Divorce is never mandatory. Too often, men and women eagerly pounce on the infidelity of their mate as the opportunity to get out of a relationship they haven't liked anyway. It's so easy to look for a way out instead of working through the problems. Jesus' exception clause should be viewed like this. No matter how rough things are, regardless of the stress and strain or whatever is said about compatibility and temperament, nothing allows for divorce except one thing: unfaithfulness. And then it is not to be used as an excuse to get out of the marriage." I found that very helpful. I think he articulates that better than I could. And I do believe that is Jesus' view on divorce. So wrapping up here, I generally tend to answer 3 questions, or I tend to seek to answer 3 questions. So what's this tell us about God? Marriage is the first human institution created by God. It is the only human institution that was created prior to the fall, and thus is not remedial in nature. Think about that for a minute. Every other human institution, right, government, schools, whatever, are remedial in nature. They're to fix a problem. Marriage was not created to fix a problem. Marriage was created pre-fall, pre-sin. Jesus reveals to us in these verses how terribly important marriage is to him and how seriously we should take it. Part of this is because fidelity to our spouses is of maximum importance in the maintenance of our holiness. Okay, sexual immorality is detestable before God. So the only sexual activity that's permissible before God is in the covenant of marriage. And Jesus displays that here. He explains to us. And think about it. He calls it, if you divorce and marry another woman without proper reason, he says you commit adultery. which is punishable by death. Do you see the seriousness of this? Marriage is very precious to God because it is the way we protect our holiness. It's a form in which we are able to create, not like God creates, but think about it. It's the way children are made. And it's meant to be holy and sacred because in the bond of marriage in the bedroom, you become one together. And so you shouldn't do that just with any common person you happen to meet on a Friday night, right? It should be long term. It should have weight and value. This is what's pleasing to God. And Jesus reveals it to us here. I hope everyone takes this very seriously. And maybe we can start to revive a proper view of marriage in our culture. Women are told to submit to their husbands, but men are never told to make sure their wife submits to them, right? There's no passage in the Bible that says, husbands, make sure she's living in submission to you. That is her voluntary thing that she does to come beside you as that helpmeet and to make you complete and to equip you to lead the home. Men are head of house, but only by her willing submission to it. If she decides to defy you, her and the kids can undermine you every day. It's her personal choice. And if you truly love her the way we're commanded to love her, it makes it easy for her to do that. But if you try to rule and reign over her like a tyrant, she's going to rebel, and rightfully so, because you're not doing your part as a husband. You can't lead people by coercion. It just doesn't work. You may get them to do what you tell them to do, but that's not leading. That's manipulation. Before I get into our last question, how's this point us to Jesus? Well, obviously it tells us Jesus' view on marriage. It's all about Jesus. I would not be myself if I didn't at least define the gospel for you guys, right? The gospel is the good news that God sent his only son to save us who are hopelessly dead in our sins and trespasses against him by giving himself up for us on the cross. If only we will believe in him, let's have faith and repent, change our ways, and live lives that are dedicated and pleasing to him. And so finally, what do we do with it? How do we apply it to our lives? Okay, if you are having trouble in your marriage, if you're considering divorce, here's what you need to do. You need to find a pastor you trust or a godly person that you know and trust and tell them the entire truth. Everything he's done wrong, everything you've done wrong, or everything she's done wrong and everything you've done wrong, right? Whether you're male or female. I normally give it from the perspective of the male because I are one, right? But tell them the entire truth. Tell them everything. Don't try to convince someone to take your side. Just give them the facts. Explain to them what's going on in your life and get godly wisdom and guidance from them. I don't know you well enough to evaluate your situation. You may say, every night when I come home from work, he beats the crap out of me and gives me a black eye. And that may be true. And in that case, I would say, at least leave for a couple weeks while you figure things out, right? Get yourself safe. If he's beating up your kids or she's beating up your kids, right? Get you and your children safe. But past protection of life, even in the situation of adultery, you need to really evaluate things well and ask yourself, am I willing to forgive this person? I said this to the men in our community group a number of times on Sunday morning. A lot of times when you're upset with your wife, if you really look into it and think about it hard, it's your pride. It's you. You're the problem. And women, I would guess, although I are not one, I would guess it's similar for you. So if you're considering, if you or your children are not in immediate danger, it would be a really good time to spend a long time in prayer and self-reflection. And even if they've committed adultery, ask yourself why. Was it that they're selfish and lustful, or is it that you drove them there? I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, and again, that's why I say this is a very personal thing. You need to find good, godly people that you know and trust that can guide you in this, because I can't. I don't know you well enough. I don't know your situation well enough. Go find someone that you can trust, that knows their Bible, that can lead you in this if you're going through this situation. But I would say one thing we can take out of these verses, these passages, is that marriage is sacred, it's important to God, and we should try to forgive others as Christ has forgiven us. And so if you're in a situation where you're looking at a possible divorce, that's my question for you. Have you forgiven your spouse as God has forgiven you in Christ? Or do you have a hard heart? All right. I will take questions, comments, rebukes. I actually expect a couple this week. I said some things that are a little bit controversial that are probably going to make someone mad. I'm not going to apologize for that. That's my opinion. Like I used to tell the folks at Cushla Bethany, if you don't want my opinion, don't give me the microphone. I'm open to correction if I'm wrong, but I will say again, in our political situation, there's a difference between a covenant before God and a social contract that gets you benefits from the government. If you want to talk about that more deeply, contact me. I'd comment on it. I'd be happy to engage with you on that. I guess that's all I got for this week. I hope you guys have a great week. God bless you. Be safe out there, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.